Good evening, and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott, and tonight we'll be talking about a subject called alternative dispute resolution, which is pretty much what it sounds like. Different ways to settle disputes short of, say, going to court and litigating, or anything even more severe than that. So our guest tonight is Faustin Pipal of Pipal and Berg. Frosty, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
So I gave a very brief, wholly inadequate description of what alternative dispute resolution is when I opened the show, but let's talk about that for a minute. What exactly does it constitute? What constitutes an alternative to dispute resolution?
Okay. Well, in the civil arena, which is where I practice law, in part, I'm also a mediator, but in the civil arena, typically lawsuits end up in trial settings. We're the only country in the world that still allows juries to hear civil cases.
Is that real?
Yes.
I had no idea
Yes.
that's true.
And,
so anywhere else, it's just a judge.
It's just a judge. And as a result, we have a lot of folks vying for very few spots that are allowed for trial. But we have a lot of delay and a lot of tough parts about the system that make an alternative a good idea. And the alternative we're talking about here is an out-of-court, typically mediation is one form of alternative dispute resolution, the alternative being to a trial. Mm-hmm. And a mediation is a voluntary settlement negotiation.
But that would be different, though, from, for example, you can have two parties who are at each other's throats in the various councils come at each other and threaten litigation, and they get right up to it, and in the end they settle, and they don't go to trial. But that's not what we're talking about here, is it?
Not exactly, because what we're talking about here is where a professional neutral gets involved. You're right. Most cases settle before it gets to the stage where you have 12 jurors in a box making a decision about your fate. But until that point comes, there's a lot of cost and angst and suffering that folks do, even in the civil arena.
Well, and it's kind of a buildup of forces, too. It's like you're getting ready to go to war.
Right.
So you're not seeking resolution. You're getting prepared for battle, and you're looking for the weakness in the other person and strengthening your own cause, right?
Exactly.
So mediation takes a different angle on that?
It does. Mediation is designed to be a much more user-friendly way to resolve a dispute. Many times, for example, there will be a trial, and a winner will not feel like such a winner when it's all over, when it's taken years to litigate, and this battle has taken place, and they come out and they say I won, and they're a wreck.
They're exhausted.
Yes,
right.
Exhausted and depleted of a lot of resources and that kind of thing. But mediation takes place in
and that's the winner, right? We're not even
right.
talking about the person on the losing
right.
side of that battle. Right?
Mediation, on the other hand, is a process. Usually takes place in the course of one afternoon or maybe a day. It's over and done typically that day, and it's a situation where people are trying to work together to come up with a solution that both sides benefit from, as opposed to a winner and a loser. It sounds cliched, but it is really a win-win.
But I'm astonished by the fact that it can happen in an afternoon. I mean, you think about what you just mentioned, that trials take sometimes years to play out.
Right.
How do you take all of that and condense it into 4 or 5 hours?
Well, the process is interesting because many times the process involves a lot of emotional outlets for folks on both sides. I learned pretty quickly that many times things end up in litigation that have a lot more to do with feelings and principles and
I'm going to get you for all you did to me.
Right. Long-standing grudges and that kind of thing. And what the beauty of mediation is, it allows folks to vent in an organized, orderly way. Typically, the mediation setting is in my office. The lawyers come in with the clients, and if you can picture...
So you're not a substitute for the lawyers. Each side still has their own attorney.
Absolutely. Right? I am no one's attorney. And I am... And that's a big benefit, too, because I have not been fighting for somebody for years,
right.
and then become a little bit...
invested yourself in
exactly.
the outcome, right?
Yeah. So picture an office where there's a neutral sitting at the head of the table, and then each side on both sides of the table, and each side gets a chance to have their say and have their day in court, so to speak. Lawyers particularly, but most times I encourage the clients to talk too. And
Which again is different from a trial where the lawyers do the talking for you.
Right. And it's also different from a trial because it's confidential. So there's this cloak of confidentiality over the process where the lawyer doesn't have to worry about what his client is saying because it will never be used against them. Everybody signs an agreement to that effect.
So even if it does, if it breaks down and goes to litigation, to trial, right, this can't enter into that trial as evidence.
Correct. Correct. So it's more relaxed. People can start off angry, and many times do, but by the time the day is done, it's amazing that both sides are really happy that the process is over, the stressor is over, and they can move on with their lives.
So coming back to the 5 hours, I'm trying to think about this myself, that
Sure.
it's very hard to sit across the table from someone and be really angry for four or 5 hours without a break. I mean, that sustained anger. And I think you just alluded to this, that there's a venting stage, but once you get past that, that emotion is drained.
Right. And this opening, they don't stay together for that whole time. Typically, we're together at the beginning. Each side has their say, no interruptions. You know, what's said there stays there, and there are certain ground rules that play out there. But then typically I will move one side to one room, and the other side will stay in the room, and I'll go back and forth between the rooms and talk about the case, carry messages, carry numbers, if it's a civil case involving a monetary settlement. And we often take a break for food, and sometimes they gravitate toward eating together, which actually goes a long way, Kevin, to resolving it. If we take a break, no talking about the case, and just have a sandwich and then continue working, and the humanizing that takes place when people break bread is pretty amazing.
So is that actually a tactic that you try to steer them to?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm convinced that when they see that the other side is not the devil, and can maybe has a little mustard falling from the side of their mouth,
and that they may have some too. So,
right.
So I'm not all bad, and I'm not all good, and you're not all bad. Right?
They both have little eagers, and wow, this is a human being in that other room. Maybe they're not so bad. That's very important to the process as well. But the idea is, ultimately to make peace between them, and I think that's the essence of what alternative dispute resolution is about, is peacemaking.
But now, what you practice is mediation, which is not the same as arbitration, correct?
Right. Often confused, and that's a good distinction. Arbitration is a hearing where the neutral makes the decision, and the decision typically is binding on the parties. So it's kind of a trial outside of a courtroom.
Also very condensed, like it would happen in a day, correct?
It would often, but sometimes they can be as involved as trials because there's evidence and there's rules that have to be followed, and it's very rigid and very rule-filled compared to what we're talking about, mediation, or principally what I do, which is probably numbers-wise more popular than arbitrations, mediation. In the mediation setting, it's not a binding thing. It's the parties come to their own conclusion.
And if they can't, they can always take it to some other level, right?
If they can't, they can go back to court and continue,
fighting.
Right.
So, what kind of success rate do you see in mediation? Is it?
It's high. I think nationally, the numbers are way above 50%. I think it's something like 67 or 68% of cases that are mediated settle. My personal track record is, and we keep track, is 9-10. I'm
9 out of 10.
Yeah, over 9. I'm batting like .910. Wow. So more than 9 out of 10 cases settle at the mediation session that day. It's unbelievable what happens when people are sitting across the table.
It's that lunch thing that does it, right?
And it's front burner for everybody, and this is it, and they want to get it done, and they start becoming invested in the process and realizing that, okay, maybe there's a way for both of us to win here.
So clearly there's some level of mediation skill that makes this better. I mean, if the national average is 2/3 and you're batting over 900, there's something you're doing that must help to bring these parties together. Do you have a sense for what that is?
I don't know. I think that what I try to do is make people comfortable, try to make a connection with not just the attorneys but the clients too, and help them understand that most settlements that aren't even that great are still a lot better than trials. I think one advantage I have is that when they come to my office, the national numbers also are cases that are forced to mediation by some kind of trier of fact. In California, for instance, and Michigan and some other states, one must mediate a case before you get to go to a jury trial. Illinois, that's not true. So in Illinois, they're coming to me because they want to come to me.
Okay, which I'm sure helps enormously. Right?
Huge factor. But still, it does happen that they don't settle, and I always wonder what happened. They always stick in my craw.
And what do you think? I mean, as you sit and examine that, what kind of things prevent that settlement from happening?
I've looked at that, and the number one common element among the cases that don't settle is one or the other party, not the attorney, but the party is not there. So, for example,
you mean physically didn't show up?
Physically didn't show up. Is just available by telephone. And it happens, people get sick, people are unable to fly in because of whatever, or the dreaded brother-in-law is on the phone, and he knows about the law, and he's going to tell the couple what to do, and he's on the phone telling them, tell them to go scratch, and he's being the agitator. Unless they're there and they can see the give and take of the process and experience it, it's hard for people who aren't there to
Well, interesting observation, too, because in our increasingly wired world, where people spend far more time in front of computer screens than interacting with each other, it makes you wonder about not wonder, it reinforces the value of face-to-face interaction. And I would guess, and I have not done this, but you with experience would know that it's much easier to be very angry at someone who's sort of disembodied from you. It's that other party and they're across town, or you haven't seen them or spoken to them face to face in a year, but you're really angry, and the less you see them, the more angry you get, until you come face to face. Yeah. Right? And then there's a different dynamic altogether.
You bet. It's the lunch thing. I mean, it really is. It comes down to...
So do you work on the menu for lunches? I mean, do you have special lunches for particularly hard cases?
I haven't thought about that. But I do have a tray of sandwiches, and I make them all grab them at the same time and encourage them to sit together. We have some ground rules, like no talking about the Cubs or Sox, because I don't want to be breaking out into a mediation about that.
No politics, no Democrats or Republicans. Right?
Exactly. So, but in general, it's I very, very much honor the people who are there, and honor the process, because it's great.
So what brought you to that? I mean, you were a practicing attorney for many, you're still a practicing attorney, right? But you've moved most of your practice to this. So what made you move from traditional law, civil cases, civil litigation, into mediation?
About 17 years ago, I had a case involving two Israeli national businessmen who were fighting
tooth and nail.
Oh, it was unbelievable. And I thought they were going to kill each other. And one of the other side suggested, let's do this thing, there's this new thing, mediation. Let's try to mediate this between our clients.
And you were the attorney for one of the
I was the attorney for one of the parties.
Right.
And I said, all right, it's worth a try. And this very experienced fellow did the mediation, and it knocked my socks off. I thought, wow, how did you do that? These guys...
and they settled.
They settled, and they hugged. I mean, it was unbelievable, really dramatic. And it took all day. It didn't take 4 or 5 hours. I think it took 11 hours, but it worked.
Still.
And not that much money involved. And I said to the guy who did the mediation, who I thought was terrific, how did you get into this business? You know, how did you break in? And he told me, and I kind of nosed around and found opportunities where I could to mediate cases. I did some taxi cab cases where I do 4 mediations in a morning, you know, 1 hour, 1 hour, 1 hour.
Passenger versus driver, there's some sort of conflict?
Yeah, auto accidents involving cabs.
Okay.
And did it for more reasonable, I was the more reasonable alternative because I loved the work. And then started doing some government work for the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, in employment discrimination cases, which I still do as a mediator, and I found that really, really great work too, and so it's just been building. So now it's about 80% of my practice is as a mediator, and the other 20% I still litigate a little bit, but would love to make it 100%.
So, not to discuss incomes, but if someone is thinking about, an attorney is thinking about going into mediation, do they have to expect to take a major cut in pay, or you still make a reasonably good living doing this?
No, it's very good living, and it's
so you don't give up anything into that material benefit.
No,
but instead you've refocused to a different perspective, right?
Right. That's exactly right. And it's really competitive to be a mediator, as you can imagine, because I probably once or twice, well, about once a month, I will get somebody after a mediation, an attorney, saying, hey, how did you get into this business? Really? And I'll have coffee with them and tell them that a lot of people want to get into the business. So it's the only downside is that there are a lot of mediators and not so many mediations.
Which is actually, as I hear it, it's a little sad. It sounds like such a, there seems to be no downside to that kind of dispute resolution.
Right.
Do you have a sense for why the demand is not there to meet the supply?
In most of the states across the country where mediation has taken off, and there are lots of cases mediated and lots of mediators, it's because the courts have pushed it. And we have not done that yet. So culturally, in Chicago and other parts of Illinois, it just is not necessarily the first thing attorneys think about when they get a case or work a case.
And speaking of that, if I think about an attorney now, certainly if you're an attorney representing a client, then your objective, well, certainly you want to win for your client, but the more you can bill on behalf of that client, the more you earn. Whereas mediation ends that, and your client relationship is over. So do the attorneys on either side, are they motivated to follow this course of mediation, or is there a disincentive for them to do that?
That's a good question. In the area where I mediate most, you're only half correct in that only one of the attorneys bills by the hour typically, and that's in the personal injury field. Okay. So in the personal injury case, typically the plaintiff's attorney, the one who represents the person who's suing, who got hurt, that attorney works on a contingency fee basis.
Okay.
So they're actually incentivized to do it earlier rather than later and end the process. The defense attorneys, I think years ago there might have been some sentiment that they would want to maybe not necessarily sabotage the process, but at least hold on to the case because a settled case yields no fees.
For them, right?
Right. But the more enlightened ones are realizing that if their client, the insurance company, is happy that they have settled it fairly and early and saved a bunch of dough,
right.
They will get more cases, and they do. And so it's as the consumer, the ultimate client, who is the parties who are doing the suing and being sued, become more sophisticated, they're beginning to insist on mediation whether the attorneys want it or not.
Well, and I think that's an interesting idea, because the downside of where you talk about mediation where it's really taken off is because the state has mandated it, and here in Illinois we don't. But that also, you have a much higher success rate than where it's mandated. So there is that trade-off, right? So I would wonder what kind of cultural incentives could be put in place in order to make mediation much more widely known and much more widely desirable.
Maybe you could have mediators on television talk about
what a novel idea. Why don't we do
start.
That? Right.
Yeah, and there are education programs that there are groups of mediators who there's an association in Chicago of a national group that promotes the concept, and there are programs in schools to take this concept of mediating disputes, which, by the way, has been around way longer than even laws and the enforcement of laws have been written. The idea that you take a dispute and have more elderly, or at least removed, wiser,
even like tribal
cooler heads,
elders almost, right?
Cooler heads,
Experienced.
and take people away from the fight and get them to agree.
Because
But
fighting destroys communities. I mean, it has a negative effect on everything around it, right? So there would be these incentives, particularly if you're talking about going way back in prehistory, at the village level. If there's inter-tribal war, well, everybody suffers. So there would be an incentive for the tribal elders to step up and say, okay, let's work this out. Right?
Exactly. And it's funny that, and you talk about a cultural thing, when in a lot of the mediation grew in ancient Asia, where it's still considered to be kind of a shameful thing to go to litigation, and it's
a failure of all.
It is.
All other alternatives.
Right, and which may explain why there are more attorneys in Chicago than there are in all of Japan.
Is that right?
Yeah, and it's a reflection of a cultural thing. It's a breakdown, and you do not want to break down. The last thing you want to do is force somebody to court, and it's kind of considered a selfish thing to do in that culture.
Now, I think that's so interesting because, as you know, if you watch TV, we live in such an in-your-face kind of society where there are cop shows and there are lawyer shows, and it's always about going to court and beating the other guy. And we seem to have, especially in recent decades, developed a kind of hard-edged culture of winner takes all. And mediation is the opposite of that. It really takes a much different perspective. So I'm kind of wondering how, through mediation or even through the advancement of mediation, there might be a larger cultural effect from that.
Yeah, I sure hope so. And I know that there are a lot of people who are working very hard. Like I say, I think this movement in the schools with peer mediation and, kids who have disputes with each other learn how to do this. And it's a skill. I mean, to learn how to not just be a participant or be an advocate in the mediation process, but to be a mediator oneself is a terrific skill for kids to learn.
So how do you learn that? I mean, you came out of being a litigator to be a mediator. So what skills did you have to learn?
Well, there are training. There's training about listening skills.
I'm sorry, what did you say? Cheap talk.
About there's a psychological element, clearly, and the process itself. It's kind of a eclectic group of the psychological, the intellectual. There's still a law around the process as well that one needs to know about. What can be kept secret, what kinds of things must be told and disclosed, and so the training was about 40 hours.
And provided by the Bar Association or by?
It was by this service that I became involved in right after that first case I had that provided the training by other mediators typically.
So how, I mean, not everyone's going to go into mediation as a career, and I assume that it's very helpful to be a lawyer because you need to know the legal sides in order to do this as a profession. But for those who are just thinking about mediation as a life skill, what kinds of things can you offer? I mean, what would you tell people who are trying to think, gee, I always fight with my spouse, or I fight with my kids, or I'm fighting with my boss, and how could I think about this in different terms?
Yeah, there are some resources available through the Association for Conflict Resolution Chicago chapter. There are books on the process. There are books on negotiation, and that would serve one well if you were looking to do that. I know that, and the field, by the way, is not limited to attorneys. There are a lot of psychologists university professionals who are in the field as well. And I know that some of the universities in the area, Northwestern, DePaul, others, offer an adult education program for folks who want to become mediators or just take a short course and learn about the skills. So that would be a good place to start.
So coming back to the larger cultural issue, you talk about teaching this in high schools. Is this something that you think that perhaps we should look at this as curriculum across the board, started early in grammar school, started in high school? If we did that, can you see this maybe changing the culture on a larger scale? And what kind of ramifications would that have?
That would be terrific to do and get people thinking about group solutions rather than the in-your-face. We see it in athletics too, by the way. As you were talking about TV, I was thinking about the chest pounding and the win at all costs that we're seeing in sports at every level, and it just keeps going, trickling down.
Deeper down, right?
Yeah, but it would be wonderful if people thought first about making peace instead of getting in somebody's face and showing people and one-upping people. I mean, it's really, again, it's about peacemaking, which really is a virtue.
Which sound, and it's sad, but it sounds wimpy. Peacemaking versus I'm going to crush my enemy.
Right.
We talk, sadly, about muscular foreign policy, and what that means is, well, let's go invade them and bomb them into submission. So is there a way we could think about changing language, even just day-to-day language, that might help in making this cultural shift?
There is. The best mediator advocates that I see are typically not the bombastic, loud, we're going to take this case to trial, threatening kind of folks. It's the quiet strength often that is just really persuasive and really gets the other side to listen and understand and ratchet things down a little bit, and folks start to listen to each other. Yeah, that'd be wonderful.
And we're almost out of time, so I would just say, the key really is listening?
It is.
That's the central skill.
It is. Listening and patience, I think, are the two things that one needs, because when I first started in the process, I wanted to get them to the solution. Let's go. But you just have to.
I can't think of a better way to end than say listening and patience. Frosty, thank you so much for being here. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. Same here.
And thank you for joining us again on Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. You can find us every Saturday night at 8 on Comcast Channel 19, and you can also see us on the web at publicperspective.tv. Until next time, thank you and good night.